I'll be in the back and I'll wait for you to get the time. Yeah. Okay? Fine. Great.
Make sure we have a few moments for that.
Good water.
Test them. Test.
Test the mic.
Good water. Good water.
Testing.
Testing. Yeah, we're on. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the CCC, the Chilmark Community Center Hall. We are glad to have you with us this morning. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors and anyone else who has made a donation to make this festival possible. We are so fortunate to have so many fabulous authors and friends share conversation about their works and life in general with us, and they do that without any compensation. So anything that you can do to support the festival today or in the future would be greatly appreciated. We have with us this morning Tina Cassidy and Carol Gilligan, who are going to talk to us, and then at the end, or with us, at the end we will have about 10 minutes for a short question and answer session where you can come up to either one of the microphones and ask a question of our author. I think I've covered all the important things, and so without further ado, I'd like to introduce Carol Gilligan. Carol is Professor of Humanities and Applied Psychology at New York University and the author of In a Different Voice, Psychological Theory and Women's Development, described as the little book that started a revolution. Thank you for being with us, ladies.
Well, welcome. Thank you all for coming. And I just have to say, this book was a revelation for me. And I think I know a lot about women. So maybe you all know about Alice Paul, but it's an amazing story. So let me just tell you that Tina Cassidy is the author of 3 books, including Birth, The Surprising History of How We Are Born, and Jackie After O, One Remarkable Year When Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis Defied Expectations and Rediscovered Her Dreams. Tina is a former journalist who spent most of her career at the Boston Globe, covering business, fashion, and politics. That's quite a trio. She's the Chief Marketing Officer at GBH. She serves on the board of the New England Center for Investigative Reporting. So, just let me start by saying I was astonished. I mean, the only thing I knew about Alice Paul was at Swarthmore, where I went to school, although this happened after I graduated. There was a women's center created, and it was named the Alice Paul Center. And so I thought, Alice Paul, and then I sort of knew she was a Quaker and a feminist, and literally, that's all I knew. And Tina has written a book, which Kirkus reviews, which is usually rather withholding, I would say, says, a remarkable tale. This book should be required reading until Alice Paul becomes a household name. So, Tina, you've done an amazing service, really amazing. So tell us about the book, and you're writing it, and how come we don't, am I speaking for other people here? How come Alice Paul is not a household name? How come we all don't know this remarkable piece of American history?
Thank you so much, Carol. And before I answer your question, I just want to say that for me, my lifelong dream is that if someone Googles me someday and comes across my Wikipedia entry, it will say feminist. And that's what it says for Carol. I don't know how you get that as a job, but how do you get that as a job? That's amazing. Anyway, I'll start by talking about how I discovered who Alice Paul was, and then talk about why so few people know her. In the summer of 2016, I was on a lovely August vacation trying to forget about the election for a few moments every morning to do some quiet writing on a novel that never came to be because I got focused on this instead. And I just thought I'll peek at Twitter for a moment to scan the headlines. And, right next to Russian hacking was Women's Equality Day. And I thought, well, what is that? And it turns out it's the day in August that marks the passage, the final ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women the vote. And I thought, oh, I don't know how that happened. Who was involved in that? What was that story? And in that moment, my whole day was blown up because I learned about Alice Paul. And I was really surprised that such a remarkable woman, a woman who led the movement that gave women the vote in America, was virtually unknown. And I got really mad that nobody ever taught me this in school, and I even went to an all-girls school for a while. When I learned about who Alice Paul was, it seemed like a very important story for our time. This is a woman who organized the first women's march ever in 1913. She was created daily protests outside the White House against the president then, Woodrow Wilson. And I learned so much from her about how to, what it's like to be an activist, how to be successful, and so forth. And so to answer your question about why so few people know about her, she was considered a militant, and at that time, even though she was highly successful, nobody wanted to give credit to a militant. So they wanted to really recognize suffragists who played by the rules, who were not offensive, who didn't hold signs, who didn't go on hunger strikes, who were not sent to jail. And that's why we all know who Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton were. I think it's going to take some time. Hopefully this is the year that Alice Paul comes to be known more in a household manner. But anyway, that was my vision for this book.
Well, I find this fascinating. When we were talking just before, in addition to the word militant, Tracy used the word bad, that she was not a good woman because she actually did actively protest and did things she was told not to do, like demonstrate. And also what she did, which I thought was absolutely fascinating, is she took Woodrow Wilson's words about democracy and voices of the people and held them up, and held up the contradiction between these words and the fact that 20 million Americans at that time, namely women, had no voice in public affairs and so forth. So I thought that was really interesting. So I want to know, am I the only one here who I carry in my head this story that the trouble with the suffragists is that they were racists, that they were prejudiced against black women, that they sacrificed racial equality for women's equality. Am I the only one who thought that was said about Susan B. Anthony? That was, all right. It was amazing to me. I read this book and I thought, it's not true. I mean, at least it's not true of Alice Paul.
Yes, thank you. It's complicated, is what I would say. Alice Paul was raised as a Quaker, and her parents taught her that everyone is equal, regardless of race or gender. And it was anathema to her that such prejudices could exist, and it was why she was constantly sort of outraged at this idea that women could not vote, regardless of their color. And when she began to organize, a little context is probably helpful here. Most of the women who had time to protest and organize were middle to upper class white women. They were of a certain class, of a certain education, and so forth. And so the majority of the suffrage movement was comprised of white women. That is a fact. It is also a fact that the early leaders in the suffrage movement, women like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, were abolitionists, and that's what's really led to the suffrage movement. They believed strongly that slavery was wrong, but something happened along the way when the 15th Amendment passed that gave black men the right to vote, and that amendment is written very explicitly to exclude black women, or women in general. They became outraged that they had done all this work to to abolish slavery, and yet they were relegated a lower status. So there were some choice phrases that were said at that time, and I think that that's one of the things that people really associate with the suffrage movement. The other is an issue that happened during the organization of this first Women's March that Alice Paul created in 1913. She invited black women to march with her. In fact, a very famous African-American sorority called the Deltas was created to march with her. And they all showed up along with lots of other very important and famous African-American activists, including, Ida B. Wells. And when they showed up, they were met by some women who thought, well, this should be segregated, and why are you here? If anyone in this room was at the Women's March of a few years ago, you can appreciate what the chaos is like in a massive demonstration like that. And I think Alice Paul would have been appalled about the backlash against having an integrated march. It's a shameful thing that happened. At the end of the day, these women did march in an integrated way with everybody else, and Alice Paul continued to invite black women into the movement, and there were many women of color who actually stood in front of the White House holding signs with her. I can't even imagine the courage of them, because at that time, the president, Woodrow Wilson, had segregated the civil service in Washington, D.C., and it was a highly racially charged environment. So it's, she's not a perfect hero in that she did not put race and gender on the same plane, but I think she believed that if she could just win voting rights for women, it would help the cause of black women too.
I think the word perfect is as dangerous as the word bad in terms of women. Either you're perfect or you're bad, which doesn't leave a lot of room. But I really think that here, the history you've uncovered and just what you said right now, is that if you were looking at Alice Paul and looking at her activities and her reaching out to African American and women and so forth, it really does change the story that you tell about this demonstration. So I can't tell you how much I learned from reading this book. Do you know how many of these women went to prison in horrendous, really horrendous conditions of freezing cold and bed bugs and inedible food and forced feeding because they went on hunger strikes? They wanted to be treated as political prisoners, and they were basically treated as bad women who needed to be, quote, corrected and so forth. So the persistence, from 1913 to 1919, or 1920, right, when the amendment is finally passed. So it's an extraordinary story, and I know several people have said to you, Tina, this is a story for our time, including that there was opposition among women to this movement for women's suffrage. Just as now there are divisions among women, still, despite the overt misogyny of Donald Trump, a slight majority of white women voted for Donald Trump. So I wonder if you would talk with us about what you see as, I agreed with Kirkus Reviews. She should be a household name. We should know this history. And as you said, we should understand the efficacy of protest.
Right. Yes, there was a split in the women's movement at that time. Maybe a little background context would be helpful here. Alice Paul was a Quaker from New Jersey. She goes to England to learn about social justice. She gets caught up in the suffragette movement there, which was, considered more militant. Brings these ideas back to America, and she gets here and she looks around and she says, why haven't we made any progress on voting rights for women since Seneca Falls, 70 years ago? And she says, well, I think your strategy is wrong. You can't just be asking politely for every state around the country if they would please give us voting rights. I mean, holding teas and being sweet is not working. So she said, we need to take a different approach. We need a federal amendment, and I'd like to organize a march in support of that. And, the old lady said, well, okay, we'll let you organize a march, but we're not going to give you any money to do it, and if you make any money, you're going to give it to us. And so they kind of wanted to draft off of her momentum and her energy, and then when they realized that people were really intrigued by this idea of a federal amendment, they had a split. They were like, Alice Paul is going to ruin it for all of us because she's not behaving properly, and we have to quash it. And so, they went off and did their thing, continuing to ask at the local level, and Alice Paul went off and did her thing and really built a movement. And it was, I focus on this aspect of the division because it is still so relevant today, where activists and movements fight over money. They fight over policy. They fight over what direction to take. And so, what can we learn from that? It's so unfortunate. I think so many years were probably lost to the internecine squabbles in the women's movement. But you're right. I mean, the women's movement today remains divided in many ways over many issues, including, race and abortion rights and other things.
So if Alice Paul were here today, what would be her message?
Oh, this is a great cocktail party conversation, because this is what we've been talking about all weekend. What would Alice Paul do now? First of all, I would love your thoughts on what you think she might do, but I think if she were here right now, she would say, focus on one thing that is really going to make a difference and put all of your energy and effort into that. I think in this moment that we're in right now, for her, that might be voting rights. So many voting rights have been repealed, rolled back. It's an issue with every election. I think, gerrymandering has been a byproduct of that. Of course, many disenfranchised people. So, either voter registration, turning out the vote, or, fixing access to the voting booth would be her focus right now.
But Tina, I want to push you a little bit. Because there's a simplicity to Alice Paul's argument, which is, what they did, and it was sort of brilliant, they would take, for example, Woodrow Wilson's speeches about democracy and everybody having a voice and rights, almost quotes, from the Bill of Rights and so forth, and say, how come not for women? How can you say this and have basically half the population disenfranchised? So what is it, for example, that makes it so hard to grant women a voice, or to grant women, like the ERA, which is another legacy of Alice Paul? Why so much resistance? How do you, having done this research with Paul and the lengths she was willing to go, how many of us, would go through hunger strikes, force feeding? These women became physically ill. They were fed inedible food. They were stripped of all their clothing. It's really horrendous when you read about the history. And they kept persisting and persisting. So I think one of the most puzzling things to me is how to understand the tenacity of the opposition, and why, on the basis of, why women, why gender, what's at stake here?
Well, there's so much at stake, and I think the one-word answer is patriarchy, right? Or you could flip it around and say it's gender bias. But at that time, the historical reasons for why women shouldn't vote is because people thought it would disrupt family life. You know, the man is the head of the household, and he should have the final say over, what the family believes and what action should be taken. They thought that it would corrupt a woman's mind. I mean, there were just so many absurd things. Part of the frustration for me is that, if you talk to young women today, they can't even imagine a time when women didn't have the right to vote. They can't even imagine a time, even in the 1970s, when women couldn't sign their own mortgage deed, right? I mean, this is not that long ago. And, really understanding what it takes to make a major social change like that is something that inspired me throughout this book. I think, for lots of people who may be activists today and feeling worn down or depressed, Alice Paul really did. She was the original persister.
Yeah.
She did not. It was 8 years of full frontal assault on Woodrow Wilson, literally on his front lawn, and was very creative in all the different ways, all the different strategies that she brought to bear to advance the movement. And the other thing, though, that I think is important to answer your question is that even after the 19th Amendment became part of our Constitution, within 2 years, that woman got a couple of law degrees, and she wrote the Equal Rights Amendment because she knew that voting alone would not be enough to solve all of the gender biases that exist in our laws. I mean, you can go out and vote, but how do you change all the laws that exist that, like I said, exclude women from things like, having a mortgage or being able to own their own land? The good news on the Equal Rights Amendment is that just in the last couple years, 2 states have ratified it. Most people think the ERA passed in the 70s or 80s, but it never did. It passed Congress, and then it went out for ratification. Not enough states ratified it. In the last 2 years, 2 more states took up the cause, Illinois and Nevada ratified it, and many people think that Virginia will be the final 38th state to ratify the ERA, possibly by 2020, which would be pretty amazing, in a century after women gained voting rights. But people are still opposed to the ERA today. It's sort of like, why can't we just say that men and women should be equal, or that any people should be equal? Why is that so hard? And this is the thing that nagged Alice Paul for her entire life.
I think the question is, why can't we say women should be equal? Because, what is the issue around women's equality? One of the phrases from this remarkable history that's in this book is, and I hadn't heard it before, have you heard it? Silent sentinels? Silent sentinels. This was Alice Paul's organization. These were women who stood in freezing rain and in cold, everything in front of the White House. And do you want to talk about the silence? I thought the silence was really interesting.
Alice Paul protested in many forms, but one of the first big protests that she organized after the march, which she called a procession, by the way. How about that for soft language? She was kind of a master at public relations. The next thing was to organize women standing in front of the White House holding signs in a peaceful protest. And they called themselves the Silent Sentinels because they refused to speak. It was as if they were giving themselves a gag order and letting the signs do the talking for them. And they would be simple messages. For example, Mr. President, how long must we wait? It's really the inspiration for the title of my book. And there would be others. And eventually they started using Woodrow Wilson's own words as he was off giving speeches in Europe, grappling with the First World War. They would use his speeches about democracy and how wonderful America was fighting for democracy abroad, and they would say on their signs, we don't have democracy at home. So they were silent, but it's a really powerful idea for a peaceful protest, and that was what Alice Paul was all about.
I think we should open this for questions. Are there questions that you have for Tina?
Good morning. Thank you for writing this book. I bought it yesterday, and I've already started it, and I think it's going to be a terrific read.
The microphone down
I should
so
take the
people can
microphone
hear you.
down.
Yes.
All right. I just started to say thank you very much for writing this book. I started to read it yesterday, and I think it's going to be terrific. And thank Carol Gilligan for moderating it. I think it's a wonderful hour. I'm embarrassed to say I thought there was a time limit on the ERA, and that time limit had expired, and that we had to start the process over. I was fascinated by your saying 2 states have just ratified, and probably we could get Virginia. Would you, A, expand upon that, and B, why is there virtually no press coverage of that? I haven't read about it. There's no big articles on it. That's a huge moment in American history if it were to happen, and I'm fascinated because I think most people are unaware of it, at least I am.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep, you are not wrong. There is a time limit on the ERA. It expired twice. It had been re-upped once. And there is a bill in Congress now that would just eliminate the time limit. So the thinking is, let's just pass that bill, and then we can just sign the ERA. If 38 states have actually ratified this very simple amendment, which basically says you cannot discriminate based on sex, what's the big deal, right? So I think the reason there has been coverage of the resurgent ERA, but as you might imagine, any kind of news is a little bit tough to break through the daily grinding news cycle right now. But there are some terrific groups that are working hard on this, like the ERA Coalition and others. And there are people you can write to and support. All of the Massachusetts delegation supports the ERA. But yeah, I think a lot of people actually in the ERA movement right now are focused on Virginia and flipping the House there. Within the last year, the Senate in Virginia passed the ERA, and it went to the House, but the House Speaker wouldn't let it come up for a vote because he knew that there were enough votes to actually pass it on the floor. So it's really close, and he's not running for re-election. So. Yes.
Yes, it's extremely hard to pass an amendment to the Constitution. 3 went through at the end of the 1910 decade. And there was a book I read, I think it was either Final Call or Last Call, have you read it? About the Prohibition Amendment. And the author's thesis was that 5 disparate groups came together to push these 3 amendments through. And the 3 were the income tax, suffrage, and prohibition. And the 5 groups that he had that were very disparate were suffragettes, progressives, prohibitionists, white racists, and anti-Semites. And his thesis was very unusual. But the idea was that all the others, in order to get their amendment through, needed the help of these other disparate groups. In particular, the prohibitionists, a lot of the prohibitionists later went on to become suffragettes. Was that the case with your subject?
Yeah, I will tell you, the suffragists were very involved in the prohibition movement, mostly because they believed that there was a real scourge happening in American families, and that was, husbands were getting drunk all the time, squandering the family resources, coming home, beating up the wives and kids, and then the women had no recourse. And then, the husband could walk away and take the house, and the woman would be out in the street. Divorce wasn't really something that could happen. So women thought that the suffragists were pretty aligned with the temperance movement, and Alice Paul was among them. And in fact, the day that the 19th Amendment passed, Alice Paul celebrated by raising a glass of grape juice.
I'm just wondering if, because of all of the different groups right now that are all protesting, you look at the backlash from, people of color after the Women's March against Trump, where it's that, is it because there's not somebody like Alice Paul to basically say, because I think there's so much division and such a lack of solidarity. What would Alice Paul do? What do you think is like the way that all of these people can move forward to getting their rights and stop sort of taking attention away from each other?
That's a great question. I think one of the challenges with the Women's March today is what they want the outcome to be. I mean, you could make an argument that their goal is to make sure that Trump does not get reelected, right? But is there another specific thing or policy? I mean, And I think that is the challenge. Alice Paul was very clear about the one thing that she was trying to make happen, and that was voting rights. And then she was very clear about the next one thing she was trying to make happen, and that was an Equal Rights Amendment. I don't know what the equivalent of that would be today, although, the fact that the ERA is back on the table, I think could be a really interesting thing for the women's movement to be focused on again.
I just want to say that somebody raised the term patriarchy here. And patriarchy depends on divisions among women. You can't have women's suffrage. Women are not a minority group.
And they're not, they make up the largest voting bloc, too.
They're the largest voting bloc. So you can't have women voting, if you want to, there's an investment in these divisions among women. And I think that what was so interesting to me is it didn't stop Alice Paul at all. There was a competing, exactly your point, there was a competing party. She organized the National Women's Party. And Tina, what was the other
The National American.
There's the National Americans for Suffrage for Women, blah, 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 which
Women's
was
Suffrage Association.
The people who were trying to do it by being nice. What's the bumper sticker about you never get anywhere by being nice or something like that? Anyway.
Good girls don't make history.
But in other words, when women start to discover that women are a potentially transformative force within society, there's a huge investment, there's a huge force that gets mobilized to sow divisions among women. So it's in some ways not so surprising that it breaks out in the Women's March and it happens. That's why this history, I think, is so important. Honor.
It speaks to this. I remember the struggle for the ERA in the 70s, and there were divisions among women. There were divisions among women who supported the unions, who didn't want special rights accorded to women. And I wonder about Alice Paul's movement and divisions. We're talking 40 million women. Now we're talking like 200, almost 200 million women. It's different. I wonder what the class makeup, how she dealt with class in her movement.
Class was a real issue. One of the biggest issues happening in America at that time was this is before the Great Depression, but it was sort of the Gilded Age, right?
Right.
And Alice Paul faced this issue a few times in very specific moments that I think make for illustrative examples. One was she had to decide how she was going to fund her movement. Mm-hmm. And there was a very wealthy woman from New York and Newport who said, open checkbook, I'll fund this for you. And there were women in her organization who said, this isn't right. This needs to be totally grassroots, funded by the people, and how can we bring the labor movement into this? They're not comfortable at Marble House in Newport, So Alice Paul, was practical, and she said, I have to take the money. This is the only way we're going to get through this, but I absolutely want the labor movement with me. I think she knew that class was really at the root of a lot of the biases that women faced. And she also knew that most of the women who could afford to stand out in front of the White House with her were women of means. Yeah. I don't think that is, maybe that has changed to some degree now. But
where is Mrs. Belmont? That's what I want to know. That's the name of the woman.
Alva Belmont, that's right, yes.
Thank you. I think it's telling that she was so practical.
This has been very interesting and informative for me, and I'm embarrassed to say I had never heard of Alice Paul. How come there isn't more about her in the history books?
Well, I think so much of women's history was ignored. It wasn't viewed as interesting, and I think for a long time it was an area of academia. This whole idea that you need a women's studies program, why? It's American history. Why does this have to be in a certain setting, right, and relegated to that? I think that we are likewise learning more now about the role that African American women played in that movement and in other movements, quite importantly, and it's about time.
You indicated that Alice Paul today would be really concerned about the suppression of women's voting rights. Can you elaborate a little bit more on where you see that happening, primarily with women of color, with Latina women? Can you elaborate more on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a voting rights expert per se, but one of the first things that happened after the 15th Amendment passed, granting African American men the vote, was all kinds of rules and regulations meant to take that vote away. So you had to pass a literacy test, and there were poll taxes and so forth, and that continued. And today there are challenges around whether or not you need an ID, a driver's license, and does that exclude certain people? There are questions around, should felons have the right to vote? All the things that are meant to suppress certain groups of people exist, and I think, we all know what they are and where they mostly happen. I think in the last couple of years, lots of effort, money, organizing has gone into working on that, but it's a constant struggle. I mean, I think gerrymandering has been one of the biggest issues that we have faced in the last 10 years.
And now the Supreme Court has codified it.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think what's really interesting, when you recall that first the 15th Amendment passes, which gives rights to black men, and then the prohibition, the 18th Amendment passes. And is it easier for women to vote on behalf of other people than to actually stand up and support? Wait a minute, if you're talking about democracy, if you're talking about the importance of people having a voice, which is the foundation of any democracy, then how can you exclude women from voting and being part of the political process? And that becomes controversial in a way that these other issues don't for women. I really think until this issue is faced right now, and I think Alice Paul's tenacity in saying, I'm standing up to say it's unconscionable that women have no voice in the political process. The implication also is that it would make a difference for women to have a voice, and I think that's interesting.
It is interesting. Something else that is fascinating to me is that political pundits also talk about women's issues and how women will vote, and there is this assumption that women will vote in their own interest or in a certain way. Of course, women are not monolithic, and women vote for their party, not for a particular ideology outside of their party. And I think many people who believe that if we just got more women to vote, there would be a different outcome in elections. That may or may not be true.
Actually, wait, there is a gender gap in voting. They first started tracking it in 1980. Women are more likely, women as a group, and this is disproportionately women of color and unmarried women, but nevertheless, women, if you take women as a group are more likely to vote Democratic, as opposed to men as a group are more likely to vote Republican. That's independent of class and race and so forth. So women's votes do make a difference. The statistic I carry is in 1996, which was the re-election of Bill Clinton. It was the first time that women's votes elected a president. And in 2000, the gender gap was larger, that's the Bush-Gore election, than it had ever been. It was 10 points in opposite directions. 10 points, women more likely to vote Democratic and men more likely to vote Republican. Now, race and class also have a huge effect. And if you look at women, and this is a comment I think about patriarchy, which is that it's mostly women who are not privileged within the patriarchy, that is women of color, single women, unmarried women, whereas the women who tend to vote Republican are married white women. I think it's a commentary on marriage, by the way. And the question of the effect on women's voices. I mean, what silences women's voices? Your story about Alice Paul I mean, one reason I so agree with Kirkus Reviews that this should be a household name was her tenacity about the importance of this issue. I mean, that's that silent sentinels. It's like we don't even have to say anything. We're holding up this contradiction. How can you be a proponent, not of women's rights or women's liberation, of democracy, and ban roughly half the population from having a voice and having a vote? And I really think that bringing this, whoever asked, into the history books, so this gets discussed as part of American history. Why? And also her persistence. And I think, I don't know anybody else makes this association, but when you think of children being taken away from parents at the borders, I mean, one of the questions, it seems to me, is where are, I mean, you could say where's everybody in this country, but especially you could say where are women? And I think it's interesting to ask, how would Alice Paul focus her movement, her National Women's Party right now, when I think in some ways the issues she fought for are so urgent? That strikes me.
I have a question. I have a little history. My mother was one of the original founders of NOW, 20 women in a hotel room in D.C., and we lived in Wisconsin, and I remember her focusing on getting rid of the different columns for jobs for women and jobs for men. And first she went to the Milwaukee Journal, and they were not willing to put them in the same column. And then she went to the Madison paper, and they were not. Finally, in Oshkosh, they were willing to try it, and they found that it didn't really hurt their economics. So from then on, you saw more and more job opportunities integrated rather than segregated.
That's a great story.
My question goes to what Story was mentioning a little bit about building alliances and women shooting themselves in the foot. So 2 years ago, I went to a Ms. Foundation event here on the island, and I'm a married white woman, and I did not feel comfortable in that setting because their manifesto was based on intersectionality, which meant you had to be a minority, lesbian, to really understand. And one woman even got up and said, white mothers are the problem, and this and that. And I'm thinking, what the hell is going on here? So I want to ask you about identity politics and how it's holding back the cause of women.
Oh, great. Just what I wanted to talk about. I think that we're in a moment right now where the movement is trying to give voice to people who have not been represented before. And what's unfortunate is that I really like the expression that it's not a pie and there's enough for everyone. And it's we should be saying, let's have more people at the table. Yes, where are the white mothers? Where are the black mothers? Where are the Latinx mothers? Where are the non-mothers? Where are the grandmothers? Where are the daughters? I mean, that's what we should be saying. And oh, by the way, where are the guys? Because I think that as we can have a women's movement that is inclusive of men who believe in progressive values too. And her father was the first male member of NOW, if you didn't hear it. That's awesome. Just one thing on the help wanted ads that your mother helped to integrate, if you will. That's such a great example of one person taking on one task and making a difference. And if we all try to identify one thing that we could do on any given day like that, think of the change. It's amazing. Yes.
Hi, I wanted to just say thanks for writing this extraordinary book, but also two questions. One on the journalism front would be, how is this possible that we are not covering this? I'm a journalist, we've worked together. How is this possible? 2/3 or more of women in journalism schools are female. We've got, of all students are female. We've got editors at the highest levels. This is insane. How do we put this story, literally, what is the strategy for journalists to be sure this story gets on the radar right now as soon as possible? And the second question related is, I'm really curious to hear how your book is doing in places beyond this island and this state, and outside the comfort zones of those who know this history. But like, are you getting invited to speak in Virginia? Are you in Ohio?
At the Woodrow Wilson House. It's coming up soon.
Good.
That's also going to be interesting. Yes. But maybe I'll start.
And what you're hearing there would be great.
Yeah, I'll start with the last question, which is really interesting. You know, when you get a call from the Woodrow Wilson House and someone on the other end of the phone says, I'm the new executive director, and she's a woman, and she says, you know, my job right now is to really tell the truth. And that about who Woodrow Wilson was. He was a racist. He was a segregationist. He was a pretty awful guy who had a very high opinion of himself, and who, after he had a stroke late in his presidency, his wife basically served as acting president, and nobody knew it. And so, even though she was against suffrage, so that's one irony. To the first question, why isn't it being covered? As you know, Charlie, there's a crisis in journalism right now. I think that, especially going into an election cycle, it's very crowded. And I think a lot of the problem is that most people, like I said, think that the ERA is already passed. So what's the story? And there's this sense, oh, it's so pie in the sky. If we've been talking about it at the other end of the spectrum, we've been talking about this for 40 years, it's never going to happen. It actually can happen. So I think, you know, if people just share among friends and that grassroots network builds, you know, that can change.
I want to ask you to join me in thanking Tina for writing this really, really life-changing book. And I encourage everyone to read it and to be inspired by Alice Paul, who was willing to protest, to be militant, to be bad, and really, really believed in the things that she worked so hard for. Thank you. Oh, Tina will be signing books in the tent.
Yes, thank you, Carol.
Thank you.